Welcome, everyone. So, just a few quick things before we begin. So, today's session is going to run for approximately 45 minutes or so. This session is being recorded, and all participants who are registered will receive a link to the recording. So, to make this a smooth experience for everyone, if you require technical support, please use the chat function. And we welcome you to share your thoughts and ideas in the chat as we go along. If you can't stay for the full session, that's fine. Everyone will receive this recording and you can watch it at your own pace. So we do ask, though, that you don't take screenshots or make your own recordings without permission. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we're all joining today. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. We acknowledge their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. Always was, always will be. I'm joining you from beautiful Deakin country, and I do encourage you to share which lands you are joining from in the chat. So, hi everyone. Welcome to Understanding PDA. I'm Christy, a late identified ADHDer with a PDA profile. So, Pathological Demand Avoidance, PDA, is a profile of autism that's getting more recognition, especially from parents who see their child in its traits. But it's still widely misunderstood. If you've ever felt unsure about what PDA really is or how best to support your child, you are not alone. Tonight, we are joined by Raelene Dundon, psychologist, author, and all-round fabulous human being. Hi, Raelene.
Hi, Christy.
Welcome. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself and let's get into this, shall we?
Sure. All right. I'll start with sharing my screen
Mm.
so that we can get going. And what I will do is just a super duper quick acknowledgement of my own. So I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands that we meet on today, wherever you are, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are participating in the webinar tonight or watching the recording. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. This is me. So here's a slide I prepared earlier, Christy, in terms of who I am. I won't go through all of this, but I am late diagnosed autistic ADHDer. I'm a psychologist and a play therapist, and I'm lucky enough to run a private practice, Okey Dokey childhood therapy, with my husband in Melbourne. And I just noticed a typo that's going to annoy me. And sorry, everybody. And I'm also a lecturer in child play therapy at Deakin Uni. My whole family is neurodivergent, so I have three autistic children. They're young adults now. My husband is also audio ADHD and has Tourette's. So we live it as well as talk about it. Well, I certainly do, and have been supporting many families over a frighteningly over 20-year period now. In private practice and across other settings like early intervention and schools, etc., through my career. So I'm really thrilled that you're all here tonight to hear about PDA. It is something that I'm really passionate about. I would like to say to any of you here that are neurodivergent, perhaps you're autistic, ADHD, have a PDA profile, I want to acknowledge that it can actually be really hard listening to yourself being talked about in a webinar. And so please treat yourself gently. You will get the slides. I'm going to send those through. I'm more than happy for you to get in contact if anything is brought up in the session that you need to talk about, because it is a tricky thing. It's tricky. Certainly hearing yourself being talked about in quite a formal way often, but also just in general hearing yourself being described for other people to listen to. All right. I've already said to Christy that I'm probably going to talk too much, so let's see how we go. What is PDA? This is the big, the big question, and where there is a lack of understanding to a point, and then also a lot of confusion, I think. So our current understanding is that PDA, pathological demand avoidance, is a profile or a subtype of autism. So currently, an individual has to be autistic to be identified as having a PDA profile. That might change in the future. We've only really known about PDA and explored what PDA is since the early 1980s, and that was only just emerging then. So it really is a very recent concept to think about this behaviour profile. It is also still quite controversial, so there are absolutely still people out there that don't think PDA is a thing. I work with an enormous number of PDAs in my clinical practice and absolutely see the difference and the different needs that PDAs have compared to other autistic individuals. So I do think it's really important to be able to identify their needs separately so that PDAs can actually receive the right support and understanding. It is a subtype that has been recognised in recent publications by the Autism CRC, that are a big research organisation in Western Australia. So they released identification and support guidelines for the autistic community, and PDA was mentioned in there. So from that point of view, I think that there is growing recognition. But there certainly are still clinicians, certainly, that don't think that it's necessary to have this additional identification. You'll hopefully see why it's necessary as we talk tonight. So PDA is characterised by really an extreme need for control and autonomy. And it's driven by high levels of anxiety and the threat response or the stress response. And that results in PDAs demonstrating demand avoidance, also demonstrating emotional regulation difficulties and really intense emotions, and a heightened reaction to stress. And I will talk about why that is in a minute as well. So these are the characteristics that we look for when we are identifying PDA currently. So this idea of resisting and avoiding ordinary demands of life is where the idea of, or the name pathological demand avoidance comes from. A lot of people in the community refer to PDA now as a persistent drive for autonomy, which sums up more of, I think, what the deeper experience of PDA is. It's not actually just about demand avoidance. Demand avoidance is really a symptom of an individual's need for autonomy. And so that can actually be a really nice way to talk about it. But from an official point of view, pathological demand avoidance is what this behaviour profile is referred to as currently. So when we're talking about ordinary demands, we're talking about everyday things that individuals, and mostly you as parents, I assume, will be here to find out information about your children. So children have an enormous amount of demands placed on them every day. They're told what to wear, what to eat, where to go, how to be. And those ordinary demands are things that most children, they might not be excited about it, but yes, okay, they'll go put their shoes on or brush their teeth or come to the table for dinner. They might grumble about it, but they can do it. PDAs are often not able to do those everyday things because when those demands are being made by someone else, they don't have the autonomy or control in the situation, and that makes them feel unsafe. So all individuals, anyone, can be demand avoidant at times. We often avoid things we don't like, demands that are placed on us in terms of obligations, for example. Autistic individuals can be demand avoidant without having a PDA profile. So autistic individuals might avoid things that are hard, or avoid things due to sensory sensitivities, or other things that they just really dislike and make them uncomfortable. But that isn't PDA. So PDA is another level again, and that's a really important thing to recognise, that this is about everyday demands. I think it's also important to understand that demands are not just things that are being put on an individual by external forces. It's not about a parent or a teacher telling a PDA what to do that results in demand avoidance. It can also be internal demands. So for PDAs, there could be things that they really want to do themselves, but the pressure of having something that they have to do then feels like it's out of their control, and that can mean they can't engage. In extreme cases, I would say, PDAs will also be demand avoided around internal demands that their body is actually placing on them. I see that more often at times when PDAs are under an enormous amount of stress in other areas of their life as well, but they may avoid using the toilet because their body is telling them they need to go, or restrict their eating because, again, that's hunger is a demand that their body is placing on them that they don't have control of. So those are more extreme cases, but they absolutely do happen, and happen, I would say, more often when individuals are under an enormous amount of stress. But it is important for us to recognise that demands can look very different as well. Now, I could talk about that for ages, so I'm going to kind of keep moving around this wheel. Using social strategies as part of the avoidance is another difference between other autistic individuals and PDAs. So what we find in autistic individuals in general is that when they are faced with something that is causing them stress or anxiety, they might try and find a way around it, or argue or complain or resist to a point, but then they are potentially pushed into meltdown, fight or flight, and become distressed. What we see in PDA is that they use all of these other kinds of strategies to avoid demands and gain back their autonomy before they are visibly at a point where they've reached meltdown. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not escalating and becoming distressed, because they are inside, but they use social strategies like trying to distract you. PDAs are, from a child point of view, the kids that are asked to do something and suddenly start complimenting you on your earrings or your necklace, or notice that you're wearing new clothes, or they might incapacitate themselves. So all of a sudden they'll be, oh no, I'm a cat and cats can't do writing, or they can't empty the dishwasher. So they find these really creative social ways of avoiding demands. Unfortunately, what does happen is, because they're able to use these strategies, it's assumed that they're manipulating people, and that is really not what's happening. They are doing whatever they can in the situation to gain back autonomy, to feel safe. And so it's really important that we flip that narrative to recognise that even though those strategies might appear to be about making other people do what they want, it's actually more aimed inward. It's so they can gain back that autonomy and control and feel safe. Now, that sociable ability in terms of avoidance then plays into this idea of PDA as being sociable on the surface, which really means that perhaps, I would say, more than other autistic individuals, they may be better able to engage in small talk. What would the word be? I'd say they can navigate social situations in a way that appears to be easier for them, perhaps. But they still have the same challenges that autistic individuals have communicating with neurotypical individuals, in terms of understanding neurotypical social norms or social rules, and that difference in social communication that autistic individuals have compared with neurotypical individuals. PDAs experience intense emotions, mood swings, impulsivity. Now, it's also really common for PDAs to also have ADHD or be in other ways multiply neurodivergent. So there can be other factors impacting that. But I think probably that intensity in mood swings also comes about because PDAs appear to be calm and using those social strategies when actually inside they're building up and building up and building up. So then it's a surprise when they explode into meltdown when actually that escalation's been happening for a little while. They're often comfortable in role play and pretending, which plays into that creativity in avoiding demands. And then they often have an intense focus or special interest like autistic individuals do, but it can often be focused on people. I find this can be particularly difficult for children because often it will be either a peer that is their friend and their absolute best friend, and they are not able to manage when that friend wants to play with other people or do other things, and that becomes really difficult. But also sometimes when the PDA has identified someone that they feel like is their arch enemy, and they are to blame when anything goes wrong at any time. And that can also be really difficult because they become a target from that point of view. The other thing I forgot to mention with regards to PDAs is just like other autistic individuals, they do have a really strong sense of justice and a real sense of there being no social hierarchy. So they will talk to their friends the same way as they will talk to the principal. And that can also get them into trouble because they're not adjusting their language to show respect for someone who thinks that they deserve it compared with their mate in the playground. All right, hopefully that gives you an idea of all the characteristics. So let's jump forward to actually understanding what's going on for PDAs. As I said before, PDAs are responding with that automatic stress response or threat response to demands. A really helpful way of thinking about this is that we have something called neuroception, which is basically an unconscious threat detector or danger detector in our brains. We all have it. Neurodivergent individuals in general seem to be more sensitive, and PDAs have been identified as having, or often said to have, highly sensitive neuroception, which means that they are on alert all the time for threats in their environment. And a threat is anything that is potentially going to take away their autonomy, which is a demand. So PDAs are working so hard to maintain that autonomy and control so they feel safe and secure, and to reduce their anxiety. As I said earlier, demand avoidance is a symptom of PDA. It's not actually the cause of PDA. PDA is about maintaining that autonomy. So a demand can, because PDAs are primed to respond to threats, a demand can trigger the fight, flight, or freeze response. And there are a few other Fs. There's flop and fawn. There might be a couple more. So we know more about the stress response now. But those big responses can occur in response to a demand, but can also occur after a bit of a build-up. So a PDA may be able to tolerate some demands and things happening within their environment, but as their anxiety levels increase and they feel more and more out of control, they may end up in meltdown. I think it's really important to mention as well that even when PDAs are using really targeted words or actions towards a person, they might seem like they're being really deliberate in their actions. They're still coming from the survival part of their brain and they are not in control. All they are trying to do is eliminate the threat so they feel safe. And unfortunately, what does happen is PDAs, when they're in that state and they perhaps do become aggressive or say things that they don't mean, that are quite hurtful to other people, they feel awful afterwards, really awful. And so there's a lot of shame associated for PDAs that have those externalizing behaviours. It's really hard because they're out of control in those moments, but they don't want to hurt people that they care about. So we really need to remember that when PDAs are experiencing stress or anxiety and responding to demands, they're not fully in control of their behaviour. Their emotion centre's taken over, and so their thinking brain is not connected. They're not able to understand what's happening until afterwards. I do want to say, because we're talking about all these challenges, that PDAs have an enormous number of strengths as well. This is not an exhaustive list. I think that quite a number of the PDAs that I'm lucky enough to see in my practice are going to end up being justice warriors of some description, perhaps politicians or lawyers, but they are so fiercely justice oriented and will jump in if something is unfair or not right. Certainly according to something that's directed at themselves, but also when they see that in other people. They are often super independent, creative, passionate. They tend to be really imaginative and can come up with really out-of-the-box ideas about things. They are super sensitive. They are, I would say, a lot of PDAs are that typical, a little bit prickly on the outside and super squishy in the middle. They often don't like people to see that side of them, but it's absolutely there. And they are super resourceful. And some of that comes through in the way that they're able to avoid demands, but in other ways as well. All right, this is from the PDA Society, just to give you an idea of that escalation that we might see. So this is a hierarchy of what kinds of strategies a PDA might use as they're escalating to avoid a demand and take control. So you'll see there that they're starting from calm and able to think and are in control. And then they're going to start using strategies to avoid demands and maintain their autonomy. So they might start just with distracting and making excuses. They might move into some bigger strategies, I guess, in terms of things like physical incapacitation. So maybe their legs have stopped working, so they can't get up and walk somewhere, or withdrawing into fantasy. Then we might see them completely taking control of a situation or complete compliance. And that's actually like a fawn response. What they're doing is giving in to the demand that's being made in the hope that no other demands are going to be placed on them. But they are still super escalated and are really close to tipping over into that fight, flight, freeze response. And so if none of those things work, then we see that extreme distress or shutdown. And I think it's really important for us to understand that escalation. So we recognise that those earlier means of avoiding demands are still, a PDA are becoming escalated and stressed. And we need to act then to support them so that they don't get to that meltdown point. Now, in terms of how to support PDAs, I actually just thought of this tonight. Hopefully it resonates with everybody. But there's lots of information about what we can do to support PDAs and not a lot of information about what PDAs actually need themselves. And so I threw this into ChatGPT to come up with an acronym. So there you go, using some different tools. But what we know, and certainly my understanding of PDAs, is trust is probably the most important thing ever in terms of support for PDAs. They need trusting, safe, secure connections and relationships with other people. If they trust you due to you being super consistent and predictable and listening and being empathetic to them, whether you're a parent or a teacher, it doesn't matter who it is, they will be able to trust that in your presence, they can try different things or perhaps push themselves a little bit further, knowing that they can stop at any point and you're going to be okay with that. And it opens up a world of opportunity for them in knowing that they can maintain control and safely try things. So trust is absolutely essential. PDAs also need equilibrium and balance. That can be about what they're being asked to do and what others are being asked to do. They need to see that things are fair and equal. So I'll often recommend, for example, in families that if a parent really needs to limit screen time for their PDA, then the whole family need to have those same limits. Because if not, the PDA, because there's no social hierarchy, doesn't think that's fair that anyone else, doesn't matter how old they are or the fact that they're working to pay for the internet or whatever other excuses that parents can come up with, it's not fair because it's not equal. And so finding ways to create that balance and equilibrium for PDAs is essential. They really, really need to feel that equality. They need autonomy, they need choice and control, and they need time. PDAs do not respond well to being rushed or hurried. And in the big scheme of things, I feel like, I think actually most neurodivergent individuals, but definitely PDAs will find their way in their own time. Rushing them just causes stress and distress. Allowing them to find their way on their own, in their own time and at their own pace, leads to far better outcomes and a less stressed, happier PDA. And then meaning is super, super important. PDAs have, which autistic and ADHDers also, have interest-based nervous systems. They need to see meaning in things that they're being asked to do, things that they're going to put their time into, and in things like rules. And we'll talk about rules in a second on my next slide. I'm watching the time. But if it's meaningful and interesting to them, and there's a reason why something has to happen, they're more likely to be able to engage in it or to follow it. So, for example, if a rule is just an arbitrary rule that everybody has that doesn't really seem to make sense, they're unlikely to be able to follow that. If we're putting rules in place sparingly, and it's something that's really important for safety, for example, and it has meaning for the PDA, they can see that it's something that's actually important to follow, they're more likely to be able to do that. And the same goes with activities that we might hope that a PDA will engage in. It needs to be meaningful. They look for meaning in everything that they do. I think perhaps also because so many things take an enormous amount of energy for them to engage in because of that need for control, and allowing that guard to go down sometimes to be able to engage, it's got to be worth it. It's got to be meaningful. So these things are all things that I feel like PDAs need, that we need to have in mind when we're thinking about how to support them. Now, in terms of supporting PDAs, and you'll see there's some similarities to that idea of what PDAs need, but in terms of what we need to do, we need to focus on relationships and security and safety. So as adults, whether that's parents or teachers or other professionals, we need to focus on connecting. We need to be predictable and consistent. We need to be accepting and be giving PDAs, and all children for that matter, unconditional positive regard, which means accepting them for who they are, warts and all, regardless of what they do and what they say, knowing that they are worth our love and our attention and our support. And they need to know that. When they've got that, they can trust us, which is what they need. We also need to be collaborative, and we can do that in lots of different ways. We can do that by joining them in activities, which then gives us that equilibrium. We can do that by offering choices, which again gives a PDA some control and allows them to maintain their autonomy. So thinking about ways that we can participate in things with PDAs, share experiences. Oh, that just swapped on its own. I don't know what happened then. But so collaborating is really important rather than being in a position of power and making those demands. Reducing expectations and demands. So you will often hear when talking about PDA that we need to use indirect or declarative language. So instead of saying, I need you to do this, we might say, I wonder what the kids are doing over there, or these things are here if you're interested, and providing an opportunity for them to engage. What's really, really important when we're using those indirect ways of communicating is that we need to be doing that to reduce the PDA's stress, not to make them do the thing. Because if we have an agenda and we're trying to make them do the thing, they're not going to be able to do it because they will feel the demand. If we're doing it to reduce their stress and we succeed in reducing their stress, they might actually be able to engage on their terms. So there is a difference. We're reducing expectations and demands not to try and make them do things, but to support them to be less stressed so they can do it if they're able. So indirect language is one way to do that. Other ways are by providing opportunities, for example, and allowing PDAs to explore things in their own time. I must have some really weird timer on that slide. I'm sorry, everybody. That's going to drive me nuts. Okay. Limiting ground rules or non-negotiables. This is about really thinking about why you have rules in place. Are they for safety? Are they to keep the peace at home? Or are they just things that you really want to have a particular way? If they're things that you just kind of want, you might have to let them go, because the more rules, which are demands that a PDA has to follow, the more stress they're going to experience and the less likely they're going to be able to follow those rules. So we want to limit the amount of rules that we have. So PDAs know that when there is a rule in place, it's actually really important and it needs to make sense. Claire Truman, who is a clinician in the UK, I think, has written a fantastic book for schools about PDAs. I might include that in the slides, Christy, so that you have that information. But she talks about using rules like lives in a video game. And when you've only got a certain number, you've got to be really careful how you use them, because once they're gone, that's it. So really thinking about what rules are absolutely essential and what things perhaps you can let go to bring, again, a PDA's stress down, and not be constantly telling them to do things or not do things, which is actually just going to drive them nuts. And this slide is going to drive me nuts. I'm so sorry. I don't know what has happened there. And considering sensory sensitivities is really important. PDAs, just like other autistic individuals, have a different sensory system. We process things in different ways. It's really hard for us to pick out what's important and not with regards to sensory information. And we can really significantly be impacted by sensory sensitivities to a point that we might experience pain and certainly can experience distress and discomfort. So being aware of sensory sensitivities for PDAs and managing those in a PDA's environment is going to assist with bringing their overall stress levels down. All right, now I'm actually going to change the slide. This is a infographic that the PDA Society have created that has the main areas that they talk about PDAs or the approaches that we can use for PDAs, and they've used the acronym PANDA to represent all of these things. You'll see that they're reflected in that last slide, but they also have lots of ideas of how you can do that and lots of free resources on their website. So picking your battles is about minimizing rules, allowing choice and control, providing reasons for things. So some of those things that we've talked about already. Anxiety management is about being creative in the way that we support PDAs. So humour and distraction and novelty can all be things that are helpful. It's very hard to be stressed when you're having a bit of a giggle or a laugh about something. So that can be a great way of diffusing situations that are tense. We need to be flexible. We need to allow plenty of time. And we have to balance that give and take. And I think that comes down to that idea of equilibrium as well. Negotiation and collaboration are super important. So working together, figuring out ways of doing things rather than having that power play and just expecting PDAs to do what we ask as adults is super important. And that fairness, again, and equilibrium comes into play there. Disguising and managing demands, thinking ahead, planning for things, recognizing what's happening underneath for PDAs and trying to reduce that stress by changing the way that we communicate in terms of explaining demands or asking them to do things. All of those things are super important. And then we need to adapt. So adapting is around, I've just noticed that I read out adaptation for anxiety management. So anxiety management was thinking ahead and some of those things. And adaptation is on this other side of the diagram, using humour, being flexible, etc. I think it's important to recognise as well with regards to anxiety management is that when a child is in meltdown, when they've got to that point, they are not in control. And we really, really, really need to recognise that their thinking brain is not connected. I usually do use a slide of the hand model of the brain. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is Dan Siegel's concept. But if you imagine that your palm is your brainstem, that's in charge of all the survival things, your heart rate, your breathing, all of those kinds of things within your body. And your thumb is the limbic system, your emotion center. And then your fingers are your cortex. And this front bit is the prefrontal cortex, which looks after all our decision making and executive functioning and reasoning ability, making good choices, all of those things. When we get stressed, and this is not just for children and not just for PDAs, this is adults too, he talks about us flipping our lid. And what happens then, so when we reach that escalated point, our thinking brain stops talking properly to the rest of our brain. The connection isn't very clear. And that means that when we're in that state, we can't think and reason and make good decisions because our emotion center and that survival part of the brain are fully in control. That's why when a child is in meltdown, they're not in control. And what we've got to do is support them to reduce their stress to allow everything to stay connected. That's just a really, really important thing to remember as far as PDA and those responses, particularly meltdowns, go. All right, now I've got a slide of some information that I will send with the slides. And you will also, there's my email address there. I'll stop share though. So I'll send some other resources through with those slides, Christy.
Thanks so much, Raelene. That was incredible, by the way. And yeah, like I said, this session is being recorded and we will be sending a resource email with that as well. So we'll include these things in there too. Now, we have had a lot of questions in the chat tonight, and I do apologize, we can't get to all of them, but I do have a few questions for you, Raelene. You ready?
Yep, go ahead.
Let's do this. All right. So, what are some ways we can support our PDA children as they transition into the school environment, especially during those early years?
I think probably the first thing is making sure that teachers and staff are aware of PDA and are aware of the appropriate supports. So all those supports that we just talked about, or those strategies, are things that teachers can be using as well. Because one of the big things that we need to recognise for PDAs and other neurodivergent children is that they don't have the resources to manage things yet. They're little, their nervous system isn't mature. They can't just jump into school and be making good choices and doing all the things that adults often expect them to do. They actually can't do it. The adults are the ones that need to set them up for success. So we need to make sure that teachers are aware and that they have ways of supporting the PDA. I would also prioritise building really strong relationships with one or two school staff above everything else. And you can do that before they start school. If they've got those connections, like I said, that trust is so, so, so important. If they've got safe people at school that they can go to, and that might be their teacher and someone else, that's going to set the scenes for them managing better at school.
Amazing.
The other thing probably would be to make sure, certainly initially, that goals are around them getting settled and feeling safe and being regulated, not about learning, not about participating in classroom activities, actually just being there and feeling safe being at school. And that's a bit of an investment in their future learning, to have them there and feeling safe. I think it's also really important to monitor for masking and after school restraint collapse. So, you know, they're fine at school and then they collapse and have huge meltdowns at home scenario, which obviously isn't unique just to PDAs, but it's really important to manage because children are going to end up in burnout potentially if they're not coping at school. So we need to manage that. And that also will mean minimizing pressure and demands at home and providing lots of opportunities to regulate and downtime.
Yep, no, that's absolutely perfect. That safety, that feeling of safety, so
Yeah.
important. So when we have kids who are, say, being homeschooled, do you have any insights or strategies that work well for supporting them at home or in these flexible education settings?
I think probably one of the biggest things would be making sure that the learning is interest based.
Mm.
So, as we've just said, meaning is so, so, so important for PDAs. So, allowing it to be child led wherever possible and making sure that it's meaningful for the child and they can connect it with things that they want to be able to do, for example, which will mean it makes sense to them as well. Um, some of that might be thinking outside the box in terms of ways to learn and develop skills. So, thinking about, which I think a lot of people ended up doing a bit of during COVID, but cooking to be practicing maths and other things, caring for pets, gardening, learning how to code, things that are a bit more practical, that there's an obvious sort of end goal or something that they're doing and working towards, and they're learning all of these skills in the process. Um,
Absolutely.
and also learning with them.
Mm.
So again, remembering that equilibrium, not going, okay, here's your work to do, and now I'm going to go off and do things that I like doing.
Mhm.
Potentially actually sitting and spending that time with them. You might be learning something different,
Mm.
but that you've got learning time the same as your child does, or finding ways to create that equilibrium,
Yeah.
I think is helpful.
No, fantastic. I love the whole learning in the home. I like to say that baking is science for hungry people. Hmm.
Beautiful.
My
Oh, I
child is
like
on
that.
with it. Yeah, he's on with it, my little fellow. He's like,
Yeah.
yeah. Perfect. Um, Switching gears a little bit, how might PDA look in adults? And do they generally cope better with everyday demands because of increased autonomy and control over their environment?
I think I would say in general, yes. I think it's important to recognize that neurodivergence doesn't disappear as
Mhm.
adults. And so, um, due to the fact that adults generally have more ability to take control of their lives and can find ways of doing the things they need to do and not doing other things, there is an element there of, yes, autonomy that allows them, I think, to cope better.
Yeah.
And our nervous systems continue to mature, and that means that there are some things that may have caused stress that we're better able to tolerate as we get older as well, to a point. Um, it doesn't mean that adults don't need autonomy. They might still be demand avoidant, particularly when their stress levels are high. So that's really important to recognize, or whether they're under pressure. Um, I would say adults are probably more likely, because they have more resources available to them, to be creative in finding ways to balance when they have to
Yeah.
um, do things that are demands, and when they can rest or fill their cup again or recharge, whatever it is, so that they can actually manage. Um,
Yeah.
I do think the other thing that we need to remember is that we don't know yet how PDA adults are going to be in terms of how they cope when they've been supported well as children. Because for the majority of adults who are being identified now, they've been through the school system and been through their childhood without appropriate supports because people didn't understand. And so I'm very hopeful that that means that outcomes are going to be even better. But we don't know that yet.
Mm. He's looking forward to a future filled with supported children who grow into supported adults.
Absolutely.
This is what we want, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Now, Raelene, this has been incredible, and I really appreciate this. And I really appreciate everybody joining us tonight as well. And we're going to finish on just one last question. And that's, what's one thing you wish every parent of a PDA could hear and really believe?
Um, I think that probably the biggest thing is that PDAs need you to do things differently, and you're doing the best that you possibly can for them by accepting them for who they are and reducing their stress in their lives, regardless of what anybody else says. They'll find their way in their own time with your support, and that's what needs to happen.
Perfect. Supporting our kids and allowing them to be exactly who they are, exactly the way that they are, is the
Yep.
best thing we can do by them, right? Wonderful. Thank you so much, Raelene. I have learned so much. I can see the chat is going off with everyone like, wow, this is amazing. We've loved it. But yeah, once again,
Fantastic.
thank you. We'll be sending out this resource email and the recording shortly. So keep an eye on your inboxes, lovely people. Yeah, thanks for joining us tonight. Have a great evening. And
Thanks so much,
we'll
Christy.
catch you up soon. Thanks so much. Good night, everyone.
Bye.